Hey guys, Sean Dove here, and today we're going to have a play trying to make some animated cartoon smoke inside Cinema 4D. I've become hooked trying to create these 3D scenes interacting with 2D style elements, so I wanted to share how I've managed to hack together this look. We'll have a play with the lathe nurb to model out the rocket, use emitters for the smoke, get some dynamics involved, and finish it off with some good old keyframe animation. Also guys, I'm going to make this cheeky rocket model available for free download, so go and grab that if you want to follow along using the exact same bad boy. Alright guys, let's jump in, we'll start having a play.
You gotta tell them all the things.
What's the things?
Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell button, link in description.
That's staying
No.
in. It has to. Alright guys, I think to start, let's have a look at building out our little rocket shape. Now like I mentioned, I'm going to make this rocket available for free download, but let's have a quick look at how we can put something like this together. So I've got a little clip art rocket illustration. I'm going to use this as a basic shape to start building out our own rocket. Alright, great. So now that we've got this in Photoshop, we can now start drawing out a spline that we're going to use to form the basis of our shape. Now I'm going to come over to the left of screen here and grab from our rulers and place a guide right in the middle of our artboard. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and what I'm after here is I just need a path or a spline going around just half of the profile of our shape here. I'm going to bring up our pen tool and place a point right in the middle and top of our rocket. And all I'm doing now is just creating a simple path around half of our shape here. What I might even do, just to give ourselves a little bit more visual interest at the base here. So now we've got a path going around just that right side of our rocket. Now I'm going to export this path to Illustrator. Great, so now that we've got that spline, I'm going to open up a new window inside Cinema, and we're going to drop in that spline that we've just created. Let's grab that and zero out its position. Nice, now like I mentioned, we're going to be using the lathe nurb to do a lot of the heavy lifting of the modeling of this rocket. So let's drop one of them into our scene and place our spline into that lathe nurb. And let's rename this our rocket body. Now at the moment it's looking a little bit funky. Let's jump into our 4 views here and frame up our lathe. Now our lathe was placed in at exactly 0, 0, 0. So what we need to do is grab our spline and just pull this over so that our start and end point are in the exact middle point of our scene. I'm going to jump back into my main view for a second, and now you can see we're starting to form. Now you can see by just shifting that spline along, we're now starting to create quite a nice rocket shape here. Great, we could go and tidy up that spline a little bit, but I think for this purpose, this is working great for us. I'm going to jump back over into Photoshop for a second. Now what we're going to do is have a look at creating the wings or the legs that the actual rocket is standing up on. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and we just need to focus on one of these. So I'm going to start my spline slightly inside the actual shape of the rocket. Now all I'm going to do is start drawing out the path of one of these little wings. Great, close that off. Now same thing, File, Export, Paths to Illustrator. Let's jump back into our Cinema window here, and let's feed in that wing spline. This is going to open it up into a new window, so let's just copy that spline. I'm going to go and I'm going to paste it into our rocket ship that we're starting to set up. We can zero out its position, and what's great is because we produced both these splines from the same Photoshop document, they're coming in at the exact same scale, so we won't need to do any resizing. They're going to be the perfect size. We'll just need to reposition it a bit. So now that we've got this spline, I'm going to drop it into an extrude. Just going to frame it up for a second by hitting S. And great, by default, that's looking quite nice for us. We could go and add some caps to round off those edges a little bit, but I think for now, let's just keep powering through. This is demonstrating exactly what we're after. So let's drop a cloner into our scene here. I'm going to feed that extrude into the cloner. Let's frame up our little scene here a bit better. Now at the moment our cloner is set to linear. First thing I'm going to do is change that to radial. I might even turn off our rocket body just for a second so we can reposition our cloner a bit more accurately. So let's grab our cloner again, and at the moment, this cloner is producing these clones on the XY axis. So now you can see as I toggle through the different axis planes, our clones actually get repositioned. Now I'm going to knock our count down to something like 3. Now at the moment, these clones aren't quite looking right for us. We want all these wings to be wrapped around our actual rocket. What we might need to do is just edit the actual rotation. So I'm coming in here, you can see I'm changing our H rotation to 90 degrees here. Great, so let's turn back on our rocket body. Grab our cloner, and we're going to pull this down a little bit. Somewhere about there. Somewhere about there is looking good. Now as I zoom in, you can see our wings are just a little bit disconnected from our rocket body here. So let's jump back into our cloner, and I'm going to turn down our radius just until we start to see them interact with each other. Beautiful. Frame this up again. And great. This is looking pretty good for us. This is a nice start. We've got that rocket body. We've got some wings there. I think all we need to do now is create that little window for our astronaut to see out of. Okay, great. So let's just rename this quickly. This is our rocket wings. Now with our rocket body, I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to feed this into a bool. Great. So now that that's set, I'm going to grab a cylinder, and we're going to use this cylinder to punch a hole through our rocket, which is going to form the shape of our window. Let's grab our cylinder. While it's selected, you can see this is pointing straight up. So let's change our orientation to +Z. And I'm just going to pull this forward, maybe up a little bit. I'm just repositioning this to where I want that little window. Might even scale this down just a pinch. Great, somewhere about there is going to work nicely for us. So let's take this cylinder, and I'm going to drop it. I'm going to drop it beneath the rocket body in our bool. Nice, that's instantly made a little window hole for us here in our rocket. I'm going to drop a camera just so we can come back to our framed up shot here. As I hit MB to reveal our polygons, you see we're getting a bit of artifacting around where we've made that cut. Hitting NA to remove that again. I'm going to jump into my bool, and there's a couple of things we can do to tidy this up a little bit. So at the moment, our boolean type is set to A subtract B. And what you can see inside of our rocket, we're actually seeing the shape of that cylinder. So what I'm going to do is change it to A without B. And that's just going to create a hole in the skin of our rocket rather than continuing that cylinder shape. I'm going to jump into my rocket body for a second and just increase our subdivisions. And as I do this, you can see it starts to smooth that shape out around the actual cut we've made. We can also come and change our spline type from adaptive to something like subdivided, and that's just going to smooth it out even more. Let's jump back into our camera for a second. Great, so now that we've got that hole in our rocket, it's time to build out the window and a nice little window frame for it. So what we're going to do, I'm going to take this bool and make a copy in our scene here. I'm going to hide our previous one for a second. And this time what I'm going to do, I'm going to change our order here. I'm going to put our cylinder above the rocket within the bool. Let's jump out of our camera for a second, frame up our little cylinder cut here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change our type to A intersect B. If I turn on our previous bool for a second, you can see what this has done. This has now essentially filled that hole back in. Let's hide that other bool for a sec. And what we're going to do is make our copied bool editable by hitting C. Now, as I do that, you can see it's split it off to the cylinder and its caps. So I'm just going to delete that cylinder, and now we're left with just that window shape. Beautiful. And now we can use this geometry to perfectly make a nice little window frame for it. I'm going to grab our edge selection tool here. And what I want to do is create a selection around the entire outside of this geometry. So I'm going to hit UL to make a loop selection, and I'm going to come over into our loop selection, and what we want to do is select boundary loop. So let's check that. And now as I hover over our geometry, we can select the entire outside of this geometry. So let's take that. I'm going to come up to mesh, commands, and come down to edge to spline. And now as a child of our window, we've now got a spline that runs around the entire outside. So we're going to take our spline, we're going to hold down Alt, and we're going to drop this into a sweep nurb. Let's now grab ourselves a little circle spline, drop that into our sweep nurb above that window spline, and let's just reduce our radius here. Nice, now we've created a little cartoony window frame running around our geometry. Let's turn back on our initial bool, jump into our camera, and look at that. We've now created this nice little cartoon inspired rocket ship. Now we can go and texture these, give that window a bit of transparency. But this is essentially how I made the rocket that you guys can go and download. All right, so now let's have a look at making that cartoon smoke. Great, so this is the little rocket I ended up with, and this is one you guys can go and grab and follow along from here if you want to use the exact same one. And this was made using those exact same techniques, really quick, and it's a bit of fun to put together. All right, nice. So what we want to look at is making that little cartoon puff of smoke coming out the base of this rocket. So I'm lighting this with the HDR Studio rig from Grayscale Gorilla just to give us some real quick feedback as we're working here. All right, nice. So how are we going to start to build out the smoke here? To start with, let's come up to Simulate Particles, and we're going to add an emitter into our scene. I'm going to jump into my 4 views and just frame up this emitter. Now we want this to be facing down from the base of our rocket. So I'm going to hit R to bring up the rotation tool. First off, I think what we need to do, let's just hit play so we can see what direction our particles are going. So we know we need to rotate this 90 degrees this way. Pull it up a little bit, jump back into our 4 views for a second. And we can just scale this right down. Pull it down a little bit more. And nice, we've now got this positioned right at the base of our rocket. Let's go back to our perspective view. And we need to give this emitter something to emit. So to keep this really simple, I'm just going to grab a sphere. Let's drop that into our emitter, and I'm going to scale this right down. Let's go something like 10. Now what we need to do is come to our emitter and make sure we turn on Show Objects, and that way, rather than just emitting particles, we'll actually see the spheres. So I'm going to hit play. And now you can see we're getting a heap of spheres coming out of the base of our rocket. All right, this is a start for us. I think what we need to do is we need to create a bit more distance between the rocket and the ground so we can get that nice puff of smoke. So I think before we go any further, let's add a bit of animation to our rocket here. So I'm going to come to frame 0. I'm going to select our rocket null here and just add a keyframe. Now my scene is set up to 30 frames a second, so I'm going to come forward about 20 frames, and I want my rocket to jump up in the air. So I'm just going to hold down Shift and move it about 30 centimeters. Add another keyframe, and let's have a look at that. Nice, our rocket pops up into the air. Great, so what we're going to try and do is while it's hovering there, I want to feel a little bit of extra movement. I don't want it to just be static once it finds that position. So with our rocket selected, let's come over to Tags, Cinema 4D Tags, and I'm going to add a Vibrate tag to our rocket. Now with our Vibrate tag selected, let's enable its position. Let's have a quick look at this. We can see this is moving 100 in X, so it's popping back and forward from the screen. So I think we can tone this down a little bit. Let's go something like 10 in both X, Y, and Z. All right, that's still pretty intense. I think let's go even smaller, something like 2, and let's bring the speed down to something like 0.5. So it's just a little bit of movement, nothing too crazy. You know what, maybe 5 centimeters will work nicely for us. To also add a little bit more interest, let's enable some rotation. Again, let's try 5 degrees in both X, Y, and Z, and bring the speed down to something like 0.5. Nice, it's not perfect, but we've just added a little bit of extra movement to our rocket here. Let's come back to frame 0, and I don't want this Vibrate tag to take effect instantly. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to come forward to frame 20 and add a keyframe for both our position and our rotation. Let's come back to frame 0, and I'm just going to zero any of that position shift, any of that rotation. What we'll actually need to do is re-keyframe our rocket as well because that rotation had affected its first position. So let's just add another keyframe there. Now let's hit play. Nice, so our rocket pops up into the air and that vibration tag builds up over that first 20 frames. And it just adds that little bit of extra movement. All right, so let's open up our rocket here. And we're going to place our emitter inside our rocket null here. Now when I hit play, that emitter travels along with our rocket. So what we want is for this smoke to feel like it's flying out of this rocket and puffing up and billowing around our actual rocket here. All right, nice. So the first thing we're going to do, let's select our sphere within our emitter, come over to tags, and we're going to add a dynamic tag. We're going to come down to simulation tags and add a rigid body tag. Let's just hit play and have a look at that. Okay, so we can see instantly we've got some dynamics. Our spheres are bouncing all over the place coming out of that emitter. I'm also going to add a collider body to our HDR Studio rig and just change it to static mesh. All right, great. So we're getting there. This isn't quite the perfect smoke yet. There's still a bit more we need to do. What I want to try and get is for these particles to feel like they're interacting a little bit more. I don't want them to instantly be pushing each other apart. So if we select our dynamics tag on our sphere, we can come down to size increment. And usually this is used to create a bit more of a barrier so things don't intersect. But if we go in the negative, we can do the exact opposite. Our spheres are currently a radius of 10. So if we go a size increment of something like 3, let's hit play and have a look at that. And you can see they're just starting to pass through each other a little bit more. They're not instantly repelling from each other. Let me push this a bit further so you can see exactly what's happening. Great, so at the moment these spheres are falling down and just sticking to the ground. But what we want to try and create is for them to hit the ground and almost repel back and create that nice puff of smoke. So I'm going to hit Command D, and this is going to bring up your project settings. If we come over to Dynamics, our gravity is currently set to 1000. Now I had a bit of a play with this and I found the magic number was about -50. So I'm going to reset that and just have a look at this. Those spheres start to push out of that emitter, but then puff back up, and gravity's not forcing them down. They just continue up into space. Great. So we've now got them not sticking to the floor, but we still want them to have a bit more force and feel like they're flying out of this rocket. So let's come back to frame 0, select our emitter, and I think what we need to do is increase our speed a bit here. Let's try something like 50. No, we're still not quite getting it. Let's push this speed even further. Let's try 100. All right, that's feeling a little bit quicker. I think there's a few extra things we can do here. To really sell this look. Now, at the moment, our emitter is set to an N scale of 1, and this means it's just going to maintain its scale throughout its entire life. If we drop this N scale to 0, that essentially means it's going to slowly over time shrink to nothing. So now that we've set that to 0, let's hit play again and have a look at this. Probably didn't really notice anything different just then. What we need to do now is change the lifetime. At the moment, this is set to 600 frames, meaning that our individual spheres can last up to 600 frames before we won't be able to see them anymore. If we change this to something like 30, knowing that our project settings are 30 frames for a second, so essentially each sphere will last maximum 1 second. Let's hit play again and have a look. All right, here we go. Now you can start to see that now this is starting to feel more like smoke exiting a rocket. All right, beautiful. We've now got these scaling down for us. But I think what we're going to need quite a few more spheres to really fill this look out. So let's change our birth rate in both the editor and the renderer. I'm going to push this to something like 50. All right, they were flying a bit crazy there. So I think let's pull our speed back a little bit now that we've got more spheres in our scene. All right, because we've got so many spheres now, they're actually fighting themselves a bit. So what I'm going to do is come over to the dynamics tag that we've got on our sphere, come over to the force tab, and I'm just going to add a little bit of follow position. Something like 0.5 is probably plenty here. I just don't want them to go flying absolutely everywhere. Let's have a look at that. 0.5 might even be a little bit too much. Let's try something like 0.2. What I'm thinking is we might want to just reposition our rocket's sort of hover position a little bit, so we're a bit closer to the ground. So just going to come over to frame 20 where we set that keyframe. I'm just going to pull this down a bit closer. I'm just going to pull this down a little bit closer just so we're just hovering above the ground. Somewhere about there should work nicely. I'm going to re-keyframe that, hit play, and let's have a look at that. Our particles are just still feeling a little bit the particles still aren't feeling quite right. Let's change our stop emissions to, I'm just going to change our stop emissions to something high, and that'll just make sure we constantly are making smoke out of the tip of this rocket. Just going to change our stop emissions to something like 1000, just to make sure we've always got smoke just so we make sure we've always got smoke in our scene here. What I'll just do really quickly is just also add a collider body to the objects making up our rocket ship here. And this should just add a little bit more interest as our smoke comes flying out of our rocket here. All right, great. Now I think it's time we start to build out the textures that are going to form that cartoon smoke look. Now I've already added some medium render settings from the HDR Studio rig. First thing I'll need to do is change our renderer from physical back to standard. Now to try and get this cartoony look, we're going to be taking advantage of the Sketch and Toon renderer. So let's go Effects, Sketch and Toon. Now first off, in our lines, let's turn off folds, creases and borders. Come over to Renderer and click Resolution Independent. And then finally, let's come over to Shading and just turn both the background and our object shading off. Now I've already got a sketch material here from when I was playing before, but let's create a new one from scratch. So let's go Create, Shader, Sketch Material. And I'm going to apply this sketch material to our sphere. Let's hit render for a second and have a look at this. Now it might be tough to see, but that sketch material is tracing each one of those spheres. To make this a bit easier to see, I'm going to make another material, turn off both the color and its reflectance, and just turn on luminance for a second. Close that off, and I'm going to also apply that to our sphere. Let's hit render again. Now you can clearly see that sketch material, it's been applied globally to each one of those spheres. But what I wanted to try and achieve was almost just the outlines of as the smoke almost is one entire piece. So let's select our sketch material. I'm going to turn off borders and creases, and I found that the outlines worked pretty well. Again, if I hit render, you're probably not going to notice anything different. We're still seeing all of those spheres. So a way I found to combat that is to grab our emitter, hold down Alt, and we're going to feed this into a connect. We can then take that sketch material and put it on our connect. Let's select our connect, and I'm just going to change our Phong mode from as breaks to highest. Let's hit render and have a look at this now. Nice. Now you can see we're only getting the outside of all the spheres that are interacting with each other. Let's pick a different random frame here and have another look. This is looking kind of cool. We're now creating that puff of smoke, and we're just starting to see some of the outlines. Let's load up this sketch material. I'm just going to increase our thickness. It's a little bit thin at the moment, a little bit pencil thin. I want this to feel a little bit more marker, a bit thicker. So let's change it to something like 10. Let's pick another random frame. It looks kind of cool. All right, that might be a little bit thick. But we can tone that down in just a second. Now these modifiers are really cool to have a play with to actually affect the thickness here. Now one that I found worked really nicely was a long stroke. So let's turn that on. And what I'm going to do is change it to spline. Now if I reset this spline, you're going to notice it's just a linear spline. But what we can feed into this is some nice presets. So if we right click anywhere in this spline editor, we can come down to presets. I'm just going to change this to sin. This creates a nice wave through our actual thickness here. Hit render again. Let's have a look at that. Nice. We're actually starting to get a little bit of change in that thickness, and it's looking really cool. Great. So we've now got that marker finish. I think to finish this off is I wanted to feel like it was nice and, I guess, thick as it came out of the rocket, and then as it thinned out and got really tiny, it started to go a little bit more opaque. So a really simple way we can do that is by using that luminance material that we've already applied to our sphere. So let's open that up, and I'm going to add transparency. Let's turn that on, and if we come over to brightness, we can reduce this to something like 90%. Let's hit render again. And now what you're going to notice is right in the middle where all these spheres are bunching up, coming out of that rocket, it's almost perfect white again. It makes it feel nice and thick. And then it starts to thin out, gets a bit grayer as it moves towards the edges and slowly disappears. All right, great. The last thing I want to do is we want to get this rocket having a little takeoff. So we've got him popping up into the air. We want it to bounce around for a little bit before blasting off into the sky. So let's come to about frame 120. And this should be enough time for him to be in frame, hovering around for us to get a nice look at that smoke. Let's select our rocket. I'm going to add a keyframe. I'm going to come forward about 10 frames. And what I'm going to do here is rather than just shooting off straight into the sky, we're going to pull him back down a little bit. We're going to get that nice build-up of energy. So let's pull him down a little bit. We don't want to go too far that we interact with the ground. But somewhere something like 10 centimeters for this scale will be heaps for us. Let's add a keyframe. And I'm also just going to add a little bit of rotation as he comes down, and add a keyframe for that as well. Now as I scrub back, you can notice we just pull down that little bit and just rotate as well. Let's come forward about another 20 to 30 frames from there. And I'm just going to pull our entire scene up into the sky. About 250 centimeters should be heaps so we don't see any of that smoke billowing into the top of the frame. Let's hit a keyframe. I'm going to add a camera so we can come back to this position. I'm just going to pull out for a second, grab our rocket, and also just rotate him back the opposite way that we did before. Add a keyframe, come back to frame 0. Let's reduce our timeline to about 200 frames. Let's jump into our camera. Now let's have a look at that little animation we've just done. We've got him popping up into the sky. What I'll also do is turn off the connect. You're going to notice the connect visually makes the smoke not appear as it will in the render. So if I turn the connect off, which we need for that sketch material, but we're going to be able to see the animation more accurately. So now our rocket pops up into the sky, pulls down a little bit before finally taking off. I think we could actually make that takeoff a little bit quicker and push that rotation quite a bit. Let's add another 90 degrees. Add another keyframe. Now let's look at this. Great, so it pops up. We've got that smoke billowing out. That little rotation before finally taking off. Nice, I hope that was a bit of fun, guys. Real simple one for you today. Great, so I'm just going to pull open that animation you saw at the start. And this entire thing was made that exact same way, using that lathe nurb to build out that rocket, the smoke using that emitter, some nice keyframe animation, just get that little pop up off the ground, and then using that, and then taking advantage of the connect object so we can get that almost nice outline finish of the actual smoke here. Now in my final render, you're going to notice the smoke, our smoke outline was actually a bit muted. It wasn't 100% black. So to do that, all I did was come over to color and just choose something that was about 40% black, and it just made it blend in a little bit more with the gray tone of that smoke. All right, guys, hope that was a bit of fun. Bit of a simple one today, but really being able to try and mix those two looks of 2D and 3D, and I'm really happy with the end result. All right, thanks, guys. I'll see you again soon. Cheers.